Diggerdan here, coming at you with another video. Today I'm doing something a little different. I'm going to be talking about my personal experience with books and just my journey of falling in love with reading and just why fantasy, why sci-fi, and all that good stuff. So without further ado, let's dig into it. So I just want to start this video by saying some of my fondest memories, honestly, are in like other worlds, if that makes sense. I remember laying on the living room floor just because there wasn't enough room for all of me and my siblings to have a chair or a couch to sit on. I remember laying on the floor watching Lord of the Rings and watching like Star Wars and watching Stargate SG-1, watching Star Trek The Next Generation, watching Doctor Who. I remember watching all these things with my dad, and my mom would like roll her eyes because she wasn't into it so much. But I just remember growing up watching all these things with my dad and with my brothers who were into it, and even like my little sister Abby, she was big into it too sometimes, depending on her phase in life and what was on the screen. And even Godzilla movies. Like I remember watching all of these things and just being enthralled in these otherworldly stories, these otherworldly worlds, like Middle Earth or a galaxy far, far away. Just all these things. So, with that being said, that's one form of storytelling, and that's one form of experiencing fantasy and sci-fi, right? Now, something else that my dad instilled me on top of, like just in media in general, I remember having books like these just literally on a shelf in my room, like with two of my little brothers, and actually all four of us were in there at one point. All four of my brothers, or three of my brothers and me, so four boys. It was more than this, but this is just a little snippet. I remember my dad had a ton of books from him growing up, reading Anne McCaffrey, all things Dragon Riders of Pern, Stephen Brust. This is a standalone, but like the Vlad Taltos series, like Jarrig, Tekla, Taltos, all of those, and Shannara. These are some of my favorites. And you having Flick in here. I remember flipping this open one time and just seeing the character named Flick. And to me, that's special because whenever I play D&D with my dad and my brothers, my dad's character is Lord Flick, which I think is really funny. And I have yet to read Shannara, so I'm excited to get it in that one, just for that connection alone. But just having these books in my bedroom that I've never really cared to open, just because they were almost like sacred to me, just because it's like my dad had them as a kid, and like I just thought that was so cool. Like that kind of instilled like reading is fun and reading is cool, right? And now you're probably scratching your head, Daniel, how can you say that if you never even cracked one of them open? Well, that's not completely true. There were a couple that I did try and read, but then I got really overwhelmed, and I'll get in that a little bit later. So it's kind of self-inflicted. But now I'm excited as an adult, as 26-year-old man, to read these and then talk to my dad about it. And it's actually such a cool relationship we have now, because for Christmas last year, I actually gifted him the first three books, the first box set for Wheel of Time, which is kind of the series that made me re-fall in love with reading a couple of years ago. And so I was just sharing that with him. Like as of today, it's kind of middle of March of 2024, and he didn't start reading Eye of the World until I think he said after the New Year. And as me recording this, I think he said he's on book 12, which is just bonkers to me that he can read so quickly when he hasn't really read for fun in like years. So just that's so cool to me. And like we went to dinner a couple nights ago, and just like being able to talk about books to me is just so much fun. So Dad, if you're watching this, thank you. I love you. And let's start, with that being said, let's start talking about some of the books that really pulled me into reading. So for most of these, I'm actually going to have a physical book to show you, but for this first set, I don't actually, unfortunately. Maybe I'll find some. But I remember the first books I vividly remember reading, like for fun on my own, was the Magic Tree House series, where it was, I think, Jack and Jill, I think, were like brother and sister duo, where they had Magic Tree House, where they would go in the tree house and they like would start reading a storybook, and then they would like get sucked in the book, and then they would basically play out whatever the story is. I forget like the very first one, but I remember there's one where there's like Black Knight, and then so they're in like medieval England doing stuff. I remember one, I think it's in like the 20th book or something like that, where it was like Civil War. So it's like teaching kids about Civil War, like American Civil War. And then like later, I think in like the 30s and 40s even, it gets in like the Merlin series, where it gets like more mystical and like kind of more YA instead of just like elementary kid. I remember there was like a jungle, like Amazon jungle stuff, like so things like that were just really cool, and it was more, I would say, educational, right? Kind of giving you a broad span of real world events or like classic stories. But it was, in my mind, it's still fantasy because you have the magic treehouse teleporting them to these different locations, these different stories, and were just so cool. And then after that, I remember my godmother, she gifted me the Boxcar Kit or Boxcar Children, something like that. I'll have a cover here. I remember reading like the first box set she got that for me. I think it was like 3, 4, 5 books. I don't remember, but I remember enjoying that. There's a ton of books in that series that I have yet to read, that I've never read. But that's an older series. So it's like those two are kind of like kind of what formed my reading habit, I would say, and kind of ripping through that. And with that being said, another thing I forgot to mention with my relationship with my dad is in the summers, like obviously there's no school going on, so something he would try to implement every year is having book reports, like weekly book reports. So he'd try to have us read a book and then write a page or 2 pages on it, due at the end of the week. And usually that would last for 1, maybe 2 weeks, and then after that, all hell would break loose, and we just wouldn't do it. And but he tried his best, and I do again really appreciate that, Dad. So yeah, after Magic Treehouse and after Boxcar Children or Boxcar Kids, I forget exactly what they were called. After those, like the first real like fantasy book I would say I remember reading was Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I remember being so proud. Like my older brother Andrew, again, thank you Andrew too, because I feel like you've been really big in my reading journey. I remember he read this and he was excited about it. And I can't remember what grade I think I was like 2nd or 3rd grade, and so this might have been like above my reading level. But I think he was just excited about it, and he was trying to get someone else to talk to about it. So I remember again sitting in our bedroom, kind of like looking at my dad's books, and then my brother Andrew, he handed me this. He's like, see if you can start reading it. And he would like, he handed it to me and like forced me to read like the first page out loud. And he's like, isn't that cool? Isn't that interesting? I'm like, yeah. And then I ended up reading the first book. I'm like, yeah, that's really cool. I remember us talking about it. And then I was of that generation too, where it's like books were coming out. I think when I started reading it, there was like 3 or 4 out. And then like, so I remember vividly remember book 6 and 7 coming out as I was reading them. And that was just a really cool thing. Again, very cool phenomenon that I haven't really had experienced too much since. Because I've been trying so hard to catch up on so many things, that I feel like if anything new, I'm just like, okay, I can put pause on that. I'm not going to start that series until it's done, that type of thing. But yeah, Harry Potter was the first where it's like I remember vividly starting it before it was finished, and I just thought that was so cool. So yeah, Harry Potter. And then after Harry Potter, I remember vividly loving Eragon. I think when I started reading, there was like Eragon and Eldest, I think, were the only 2 that were out. And this again is by Christopher Paolini. And I remember, like, I know people kind of give Eragon crap, just because I think he was like 15 or 16 when Christopher wrote this. And looking back now, if I read this today, it definitely shows. But I just remember I was like 12 or 13 at the time. I'm just like, this is so cool. This is such a cool story. But then my older brother, who also loved it, but a couple years after, he's like, oh yeah, that's basically just like Star Wars, but in Fantasyland. I'm like, all right, Andrew, thanks. I'm like, whatever you say, dude. And like looking back, he's like, he's not wrong. But this is really the first fantasy book I remember kind of falling head over heels for. I remember reading this multiple times, like on the bus. This is technically Andrew's copy, that he again gifted me, but I remember reading this, and even our little brother Josh, he was reading it, and I remember it like fell off his lap or something, and like split in half, like right down, because this is obviously the movie version, which the movie doesn't exist, but on the cover it does. but then it split right down where you got the movie pictures. And I remember my older brother being so mad, and Josh being like so upset and timid and like feeling so bad, like he didn't mean to break it, right? Um, anyway, Aragon. And I do remember, again, like I said, I remember reading this, like, Eldest, specifically on the bus. And then you can kind of sort of see up here, I did get Eldest, or excuse me, I did get Bersinger. And then I think I was in high school when Inheritance finally came out, book 4 in the Inheritance cycle. I remember buying it. It was like, and at that time I wasn't really reading, but I was like, it's Aragon, I gotta get it. And it was, of course, the thickest book, too, and I was just so intimidated at the time. But I read it, and I loved it. So, yeah, I would say Aragon might be, like, the biggest formative series for me, at least growing up. So, yeah, Aragon is whatever number this is. I don't even know if I'm numbering them. And then kind of around the same time as Aragon, when I was introduced to that and kind of fell in love with it, that's when Percy Jackson was huge. I can't remember how many books were out, but I do remember reading. For some reason, I thought I only read the first 3 or 4, but then I reread these a couple years ago, and after I got into the last book, book 5, I think Hero of Olympus, I think is what it's called. I remember, I'm like, this is very, very familiar. I do remember reading this. So I do actually remember reading all 5 of them in like middle school even. And I think a lot of people really love this. And of course for me it was really kind of weird too, because in like 6th, 7th, 8th grade, that's when like in English class they really push like Greek and Roman mythology, like especially Greek mythology. So it was like this kind of coincided with like the whole Greek mythology English class stuff, which I thought was really cool because it's like I'm actually seeing like what I'm learning in class on paper, and like even though it's obviously fictional, for me that was just really really cool, and I think that's what resonated with a lot of my classmates too, just because of the timing of Percy Jackson getting popular and then also being big into like Greek and Roman mythology. So yeah, I just thought that was cool. So. And then after that, after I remember starting Percy Jackson, I'm like, okay, what other fantasy is there? And I remember vividly going up and down the shelves, and I just randomly pulled this one off. Like, it was like this. I'm like, oh, Martin the Warrior, that sounds cool. And then I saw that he was a mouse. I'm like, that's even cooler. So I remember, I think it was like towards the end of the year. Like, it was almost summer. So we had a little more free time in class or whatever. I think it was like 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. I don't remember exactly. So I remember pulling this off. But I don't think I finished the book because I think I borrowed it from my school library, and then I had to give it back before we left for the summer. So I think I maybe got like halfway through it and then left home for the summer, and I just never picked it back up. But I remember having very fond memories of what I did read, and just Martin the Warrior and just Redwall and just the Abbey and just all those things. Like I just have fond memories even though I hadn't even read a whole book. So you can kind of see behind me a couple years ago when I started getting back into reading, I bought a bunch of them. And I've read the first 3. I think I maybe read the first 4. I don't remember. And now I'm kind of saving these for my kids. So this is going to be our bedtime book. At least that's the plan. Maybe I'll be too impatient. I'll read them before. But there's just so many good things to read right now. So, yeah, Martin the Warrior. And then I remember after that, kind of was still big on a lot of the books I already read, like the Aragon and Percy Jackson, in between like Redwall and now. But I remember Hunger Games and Divergent was kind of big at the same time for us, or at least growing up. Kind of a little after, I would say, Percy Jackson. I would say like 7th, 8th grade, maybe even 9th grade. But I remember liking Hunger Games a lot more than Divergent. Divergent I enjoyed, but it was maybe too political, if that makes sense. Where it's like Hunger Games, in my mind, from what I remember, was more action-packed and just more exciting. And it wasn't as thick, so I feel like you got more bang for your buck, at least, or more bang per page. I'm kind of putting these the wrong way. Again, that's what I remember. I haven't read these in years. I know Hunger Games got big again with that prequel movie that came out, the prequel book that came out last year maybe. But yeah, I don't even think I finished the Divergent series. I think I own all 3. Technically, there's a 4th book where it's from the perspective of four the guy named Four, in the first book, I think. But I only own the first 3, the completed trilogy. And I think I read 1 and maybe stopped halfway through 2, or maybe I finished 2 and never picked up 3. I don't remember. But I do remember reading all of the Hunger Games and was disappointed with the ending, with Prim. If you know, you know. But yeah, again, I remember enjoying Hunger Games overall. So, yeah. And then after that, sort of maybe around the same time, I remember my sisters were really, because I have 4 sisters as well, were really big into Twilight and like the Twilight saga. Because I think at the time they were 3 or 4. I don't know if all the books were out yet. I think 3 of the books were out, and I think maybe the 4th one was coming out soon. So my older sister, I think Ashley had this one, or maybe Emily. Regardless, they're like, I asking if it was any good, and they offered. They're like, they lent it to me. And I remember reading the first book. I'm like, this is all right. Maybe a little too much romance for me. They convinced me like, oh yeah, it's vampires. It's cool. I'm like, okay, cool. And I remember reading this one on the bus and like talking to one of my other friends who also read it, thinking it would be good. And he liked it more than I did, and I think he continued with the series. But I think I was like one and done. I think I started New Moon, which is book 2, and I don't think I ever finished it. I'm like, this doesn't have dragons. This is stupid. But eventually I do plan on reading the series, because this is actually my wife's copy. She has, I think, all the books in the Twilight saga. She has the original 4, and then, I don't know, the 2 other ones as well. But yeah, Twilight, which was a little disappointment, but just kind of a funny thing I thought I'd bring up. And then I know kind of sprinkled in there, this is an older copy, but I do remember reading A Wizard of Earthsea. This is obviously the completed trilogy in one, because they're like novella size. But I remember that my dad, this is like the one of the couple things that I did take off that shelf that had my dad's books on it that I did read. It was like this, Clash of the Titans. That's what I'm remembering just now. I wish I had that copy, but I don't. Clash of the Titans, kind of similar with Percy Jackson, where it was that whole Greek mythology thing. I think that remake movie was coming out around the same time, or maybe a couple years before the movie came out. I read that book. But anyway, I remember reading the first book of the Earthsea trilogy. I think I started the second one, and I just kind of got bored. Maybe didn't understand it. I probably read it too young. But I have heard, as an adult, I've heard more good things about the series in Ursula K. Le Guin than I have since reading it. So I'm excited to get back into it. But yeah, this was kind of a mid book for me. But a book series that I probably was probably too young to read, but I loved it, was actually Hackin' by Eric Nielsen. And so this is a 4-book series. I'm trying to think of the word that has 4 of them, but they're very tiny. I think they're technically novellas. Yeah, like this first book is 208 pages, but you get so much bang for your buck. There's so much in it. It's Vikings, right? But it's kind of realistic. It's like semi-magic, where he has like a magic axe, right? And it's really cool. I especially as a teenager, this was amazing. I remember I read like the first 2 that my dad had, and I really liked it. And he didn't have like the 3rd or 4th one, so we got whatever book or 2 books that were missing for my birthday. For like 15 or 16. It was really cool. But again, the reason I say I probably shouldn't have read this is just because there's a lot of nudity and sex scenes. Maybe not even that much. I remember there are a couple different sex scenes. I'm like, I should not be reading this. I do remember reading these again a couple years ago, and I flew through them, and I'm like, they're probably just about as good as I remember them being, to be honest. So if you can get your hands on one of these books, I would highly recommend it. And then one of the books that was on my dad's shelves was Stephen R. Donaldson, or by him, that I tried to read but I couldn't. Like, it was just too hard. Was Lord Vallo's Bane. I have up there, you can sort of see, I have the 6 books and like the first 2 chronicles. I think there's only 2 chronicles from Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever. Could be wrong. But I remember as a kid trying to read, or as a young teenager, I should say, trying to read this one, because it was my dad's book. I remember him talking about it, liking it. Trying to read it, and it was too dense. It was way too dense. I don't even think I got 20 pages in, and I'm like, what am I reading? I don't understand any of this. So this is another one where, as an adult, I plan on reading and hopefully will enjoy it. Because I've heard even as an adult, I've heard for a lot of people this is dense. But if you're patient with it, the story does pay off. So that's exciting. And then this might be controversial, but I remember reading The Hobbit and actually not enjoying The Hobbit. I think I was 13 or 14 at the time, so I was the appropriate age, because The Hobbit, people say, is technically a kid's book or children's book, and I didn't really like it. And I think part of the reason is I remember loving the movies, and I think I was maybe holding it to the movies. I'm like, I expect it to be so action packed and all these things, and maybe it just was also maybe Tolkien's prose. There's probably a couple different things, but yeah, I remember I only read it that one time, so I'll probably have to give it another shot. But yeah, I didn't really care for The Hobbit, but I do remember reading it as a kid. And I remember my little brother Josh, he read it, and I think he really enjoyed it. So props to him, but I guess it wasn't for me. So then after that, like I said, Aragon was kind of like the one series that I would keep reading throughout. But after that, and like I got in high school, books to me weren't as fun as they used to be. So I was more into the comics and like graphic novels. So I remember like reading like Deadpool kills the Marvel Universe. I thought that was really cool, really funny. I was like big into like the whole like watching like comics YouTube channels. People were like, "Oh yeah, Nemesis is so good. It's such a good one-off." And it is so gory, but it is really good. And then of course you got the two classic Joker graphic novels you just gotta have, right? So I remember reading more comics and things like this, especially because that's when like the Avengers movie or the Marvel movies were like really getting going, like really popular. So yeah, that's kind of when I fell off the wagon of reading. And more, it was again high school, so I was more into video games, more into girls, more into sports, things like that. And then I went into college, still kind of having the love of fantasy from like video games and media and even the books I kind of already listed reading as a kid. But then again, I fell out of reading, and I think it was like my sophomore, maybe junior year, maybe I think it was the summer between those two. One of my friends from high school, who's actually my cross country coach, he lent me American Assassin by Vince Flynn because he said he just read it, and it's the first in the series. And it's a spy thriller. It's how Mitch Rapp, who is big in the thriller space, I guess. That character like is trained in this, and like his first missions are in this. And he really liked it, so he lent it to me, and I remember reading it. I think it was over spring break or maybe Easter break. Something I can't remember exactly. But reading it on the car ride, because we were going somewhere. I can't remember exactly where we were going. But I read it, and I was like enthralled. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's right. I do like reading. And for me, it was different because this isn't fantasy, right? This is like modern era spy thriller, assassin thriller, right? Hence American Assassin. So I just was surprised, like realizing just reading in general can be fun. But then I didn't really pick up too many books really until after college, because any book at that point was a textbook, and it just like, I don't want to read, right? So it kind of killed reading as a fun thing for me. But this kind of reminded me, reading can be fun. So then after I graduated and I got married to my wife, and we moved in together in an apartment and just kind of working, I realized I kind of miss things from my childhood, right? You kind of get to that point. And reading was one of those things. Like I did have my Aragon books. I was kind of reading the first one. I'm like, this kind of feels a little childish, but it's like nostalgia was holding true. So I remember reading those books. And I was talking to my older brother, Andrew, about it. And he's like, oh, yeah, I just read Name of the Wind. Or he didn't finish it. He's like halfway through. This was years ago, and he's still only halfway through. You can have your copy back, bro, by the way, if you're watching this. So he read halfway through, and he's like, dude, I'm loving it. But work's crazy right now. Like, my home life is crazy. Like, if you want to borrow it and read it, like, go for it. You'll probably finish it before I ever even try to pick it up again. I'm like, okay. So yeah, I read Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Say what you will about the man. Is he going to finish book 3? I don't know. But at that point, I didn't know any of that. My brother's like, hey, I'm halfway through this, and I love it. I want you to borrow it and read it. so we can maybe talk about it. And I read this book, and this was probably the quickest I've ever read a book this thick. Because I don't even, how many pages are there? There's over 660 some pages. I don't remember my timeline, but at that point it was maybe 2 weeks. Probably less than 2 weeks. I could go to my Goodreads and tell you. A lot of these I do have my Goodreads now because I've reread some of them since. So if you want to see more details on that, go check out my Goodreads, link down below. But yeah, I read this book. I'm like, this is what reading, like authors can do that? Like this blew my mind with world building, and obviously Rothfuss, everyone admits, has amazing prose. I fell in love with Rothfuss, or at least his writing style, and it kind of really rekindled my longing to read again. Like reading is so cool. And then it was at that point where I'm like, all right, I'm gonna finish reading the rest of the Aragon. So I remember finishing some of that, and I remember like thrifting a couple different like Dragon Riders or Pern books. So I think I read like Chronicles of Pern, where it's like a couple different short stories, which Anne McCaffrey recommends you don't do that. She recommends you read them in publication order, which is fair. I think the Chronicles of Pern is like 19 or 20th book, something like that. So maybe spoiled something for me, but that's okay. And at that point, that's when I had a couple of the Redwall books, so I was reading some of those. And then after that, I think immediately after I finished reading Name of the Wind, that's when I started reading Eye of the World, Wheel of Time Book 1. And then just from there, you can look at my Goodreads, you can look at my YouTube channel. Yeah, that's my reading story, guys. I'm curious, how similar is that to some of you guys? Is that, like, I know age groups vary widely. But if, like my dad, for example, he's much different generation, so he's read a lot of different stuff. But even people, like if you're 16, 17 right now, what are you reading right now? Like you're in your formative years. Embrace it, first of all. Like, awesome to you for reading. But I just would love to know what you guys have read growing up, what you're currently reading. What's the book or series that made you fall in love with reading again? What's the book or series that made you fall in love with reading in the first place? I just love hearing these stories. It's part of the reason I wanted to make a booktube, is to have that communication with people and just enjoy the love of books together. So anyway, that's for me today, guys. I know different. Me just talking, that's just about myself, which I know is a little weird. It felt weird doing it, at least, but it was really cool to kind of reminisce a little bit and just remember why I love books, or where my joy and love for books came from. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys enjoyed this video, please hit like down below. If you guys want to see more from me, Diggerdan, please hit that subscribe button, as well as that bell notification icon, so you guys know when I upload each and every single time. And I will see you fools in the next one. Thanks for watching.